idea in contemporary moral philosophy than the idea that Kant's ethical philosophy fundamentally and absolutely prohibits lying. So I bore witness to this last year when I observed a graduate student in my department as she taught a lesson in her introductory ethics course. She was having the students compare how a utilitarian, a Kantian, and a virtue ethicist would respond to a particular scenario. And she was treating the absolute prohibition on lying as if it were the most fundamental feature of Kant's ethical theory. On the one hand, she was simply taking Kant at his word. It's well known that Kant makes extreme, absolutist claims about lying. On the other hand, it seems problematic to simply take Kant at his word without being able to connect Kant's condemnation of all lies to the fundamental principles of his theory. So this got me thinking about what the most defensible Kantian position on lying might be, and I was kind of surprised that I had no answer to this. So here are my questions. Can Kant's absolute condemnation of ethical lying be vindicated, and if so, how? A lot has been written about the murderer at the door essay, where Kant talks about juridical lies. I'm interested in the broader category, the category Kant calls ethical lies. And I don't think we can answer this first question without also answering the second set of questions. So what makes lying wrong? Another way to phrase this is to ask, what is the wrong-making feature of lying? Do all lies have this feature or only some lies? And in trying to answer these questions, I want to be sensitive to the possibility that some accounts of the wrong-making feature of lying have implications for other types of behavior. And I'm particularly interested in reticence and concealment. So when we're considering some candidate for the wrong-making feature of lying, I think we should also ask whether other practices also have that feature as well. For the purposes of the paper, I'll understand a lie to be a statement or assertion that the speaker believes to be false and intends for another to believe to be true. So James Mahan has a paper that attributes this account of lying to Kant. I think it's more accurate to say that Kant did not consistently endorse a single account of what a lie is, and I'll present some evidence for this shortly. I've also included Sienna Schifrin's slightly different account of lying on the handout, and I'll refer to that a little later in the paper. As many others have pointed out, lying and deception are two distinct phenomena. A lie does not have to deceive in order to be a lie. Likewise, there are many forms of deception that do not involve lying. As Schifrin describes it, both lies and deception turn on a particular sort of mental content. But the crucial mental content for the lie is the disbelief of the speaker in what she says, and the crucial mental content picked out by deception is the listener's formation or confirmation of a false belief. So what I plan to do in the paper is to consider 4 different attempts to answer the question, what makes lying wrong? I start with Kant's doctrine of virtue account. Then I consider the using merely as a means account. Then I consider Wien-Dubing's, am I saying that right? Wien-Dubing? Wien-Dubing? No? Am I saying that name right?
No. Wien-Dubing.
Wien-Dubing, okay. His account that came out last year in Kant-Zentrum. And finally, I'll consider Sienna Schifrin's 2014 account from her Speech Matters book. I'll then draw some preliminary conclusions. So why does Kant believe it's wrong to lie? In the doctrine of virtue, Kant claims that the wrong-making feature of lying is not to be found in the harm caused by the lie. Rather, Kant contends that, and this is quote A on the handout, communication of one's thoughts to someone through words that yet intentionally contain the contrary of what the speaker thinks on the subject is an end that is directly opposed to the natural purposiveness of the speaker's capacity to communicate his thoughts, and is thus a renunciation by the speaker of his personality, and such a speaker is a mere deceptive appearance of a human being, not a human being himself. In this passage, Kant identifies what he takes to be a wrong-making property common to all instances of lying. Lying is directly opposed to the natural purposiveness of the speaker's capacity to communicate, which is the accurate representation of the speaker's thoughts. I think we should find Kant's doctrine of virtue account of the wrongness of lying unsatisfying for at least 3 reasons, 2 of which have already been identified in the secondary literature. So first, Kant relies on an unsupported claim regarding the natural purposiveness of our capacity for communication. Why think that the natural purposiveness of this capacity is the accurate representation of our thoughts as opposed to some other end? Samuel Kirstein has raised this question and suggested that survival is an equally plausible candidate. Second, Kant's account relies on the assumption that the natural purposiveness of our capacity for speech is normative for us, but it's not obvious why this would be the case. As David Sussman has observed, Kant never explains why the teleology that characterizes us as natural beings should be morally authoritative for us as free agents. Kant's claim that all lies violated a duty to humanity in one's own person based on the natural purpose of speech would seem to be on no firmer ground than a similar categorical denunciation of homosexuality and masturbation. Kant's doctrine of virtue account of the wrongness of lying is strikingly similar to his account of the wrongness of homosexuality and masturbation. If we're inclined to reject the latter, I think we should also be inclined to reject the former, assuming we cannot plausibly differentiate the two. A third problem with Kant's doctrine of virtue account of the wrongness of lying is that the wrong-making feature Kant identifies is not unique to lying. Common speech acts like sarcasm and joke-telling would seem to be cases where we utilize our capacity to communicate in a manner that's contrary to the natural purposiveness of accurately representing our thoughts. A passage from the Herder Lectures on Ethics reports Kant making exceptions for some of these kinds of speech acts, and this is quote B on the handout. A white lie is often a contradictio in adjecto. Like pretended tipsiness, it is untruth that breaches no obligation, and thus properly no lie. Joking lies, if they are not taken to be true, are not immoral. Here Kant appears to endorse the third necessary condition for a lie as endorsed by Mahan and Schifrin. According to that third condition, if I do not intend for the speaker to take what I say to be the truth, or an accurate representation of my thoughts, then I do not lie. Notably, this passage from the Lectures on Ethics is not consistent with what Kant writes in the Doctrine of Virtue. This is quote C on the handout. Kant writes, in the Doctrine of Right, an intentional untruth is called a lie only if it violates another's right. But in ethics, where no authorization is derived from harmlessness, it is clear that no intentional untruth in the expression of one's thoughts can refuse this harsh name. This is why I don't think we find consistency in how Kant understands the notion of a lie. So the relevant question is not whether joking untruths are lies or not, but rather whether joking untruths are opposed to the natural purposiveness of the speaker's capacity to communicate his thoughts accurately. And they do appear to have this feature. If having this property is sufficient to render lying immoral, then joking untruths would have to be immoral for the same reason. Other speech acts conceal our thoughts or misrepresent our thoughts without lying. In a paper on benevolent lies, Tom Hill distinguishes lying from what he calls deceptively ambiguous responses. He presents the following exchange as an example of the latter. A person asks me, simply from curiosity, do you know if so-and-so is gay? And though I know, I answer, how should I know? This deceptively ambiguous response, how should I know, is not technically a lie in virtue of the fact that the speaker poses a question rather than an assertion. However, the phrase, how should I know, and I have no idea, are roughly semantically equivalent in the English language. Again, if we accept Kant's account of the wrongness of lying, we'll have to accept that many speech acts which are not instances of lying are also morally wrong. In light of these problems with Kant's account, I think we need to look elsewhere to determine what makes lying wrong. So one might think that we can explain the wrongness of lying by appealing to the notion of using another merely as a means. While I think that using another merely as a means is sufficient to establish that something is wrongful, I don't think this is a property that all lies have. So I don't think this account, plausible as it is, can vindicate Kant's condemnation of all lies. So consider Kant's groundwork example of the false promise. This case involves lying as well as deception and using another. As Christine Korsgaard has observed, if the lie does not deceive the recipient of the false promise, then it's no longer a case of false promising. She explains, if I call your bluff openly and say, never mind that nonsense, just take this money, then what I am doing is not accepting a false promise, but giving you a handout and scorning your promise. The nature of the transaction has changed. Now it is not a promise, but a handout. If I don't call you on it, but keep my own counsel, it is still the same. I am not accepting a false promise. In this case, what I am doing is pretending to accept your false promise. In the false promising case, A using B merely as a means seems to depend on A succeeding in deceiving B with regard to the false promise, not merely A lying to B. However, if Kant is correct in thinking that we have a perfect duty not to lie to others, then the lie told by the false promiser would be wrong, even if the recipient does not believe the lie. Just as not all lies deceive, not all lies use others merely as a means. So consider the following case. An acquaintance asks whether you've ever had an abortion. You have had an abortion, but you're not comfortable sharing this information with this particular person. You reply, no, I've never had an abortion. I contend that your response to the acquaintance is a lie. But when you tell this lie, you do not use the acquaintance merely as a means, because you don't use her as a means at all. Different accounts of when one agent uses another as a means can be found in the secondary literature. Samuel Kirstein proposes the following. This is D on the handout. An agent uses another, or equivalently uses or treats another as a means, if and only if she intentionally does something to or with some aspect of the other in order to realize her end, and she intends the presence or participation of some aspect of the other to contribute to the end's realization. When you lie to the acquaintance about never having had an abortion, you do intentionally do something to her in order to realize your end of keeping certain information concealed. However, you do not intend the presence or participation of the acquaintance to contribute to the end's realization. In the scenario described above, the acquaintance is more of an obstacle to your end than a means. We can see this by observing that your end of keeping personal information private would be better served by her absence than her presence or participation. To borrow an example from Kirstein, when you lie to the acquaintance, you act as a police officer does when he pushes a bystander out of the way in pursuit of the suspect. The police officer does something intentionally to the bystander, but the bystander does not serve as a means to the police officer's end. The bystander is an obstacle rather than an instrument. Similarly, Paulina Kleingel has suggested that, this is E on the handout, an agent uses another person as a means if and only if, in the agent's practical reasoning underlying the action, the other serves to realize or promote the agent's ends. This account of using another also supports the conclusion that you do not use the acquaintance as a means when you lie about not having had an abortion. Rather than serving as a means to the realization or promotion of your end, keeping personal information concealed, the acquaintance threatens this end. Again, your end would be better served by her absence. Paulus Kaufman also has an account of when we use others as a means. It would take half a page to report his account of this, so I didn't put it on the handout or in the paper, but I think it also supports the same conclusion. It's kind of surprising to me that there's not more literature on when one agent uses another, but if anyone knows of other accounts, I'd be interested in that. All right, so some forms of conduct, like exploitation and coercion, necessarily involve using another. But I don't think lying is like this, and I think this is one of the reasons that makes lying such an interesting case. I want to just take a moment and distinguish the argument I'm making from an argument that James Mahan makes in a paper published in 2006. So I have argued that not all lies use others merely as a means, because not all lies use others, and using others is a necessary condition for using them merely as a means. Mahan has defended the position that not all lies use others merely as a means because it's possible to consent to be lied to. that some lies are morally permissible according to the standards set by Kant's formula of humanity. I think Mahan's argument is flawed, and I'm happy to discuss this later, but it's nonetheless an interesting question whether or not one can consent to be lied to in the future, and whether or how this is relevant to our moral assessment of a lie. If we accept that not all cases of lying are also cases of using another merely as a means, it looks like we have two options. First, we could accept that what makes lying wrong when it is wrong is that it's an instance of using another merely as a means. This option would not vindicate Kant's absolute prohibition on lying, given that not all cases of lying are also cases of using another merely as a means. A second option is to reject the idea that the wrongness of lying is exhausted by the wrongness of using another merely as a means. If we take this option, then we should seek out other wrong-making features of lying. And this option leaves open the possibility that Kant might be vindicated. So, Wien Dubig's account. So Wien Dubig has recently offered a compelling explanation for why Kant absolutely forbids inner lies or lies to oneself. Dubig argues that insofar as being truthful is a necessary condition for being virtuous, Kant cannot allow for any inner lie, and each and every inner lie constitutes a frontal attack on the possibility of a human being attaining virtue. Attaining virtue requires that we be transparent with ourselves, whereas a lie poisons the well of inner awareness, for example, awareness of our own motives of action. I find Dubig's justification for the absolute prohibition on inner lies very plausible and compelling. I'm skeptical, however, of how well this justification transfers to external lies, or lies that we tell others. Dubig writes, this is F on the handout, Kant's doctrine of virtue view on the inner lie also implies a strict view on the outer lie. He proceeds to explain that, G on the handout, Kant sees a strong connection between the two forms of lying. Kant held that an external lie implies an internal lie, or more precisely, that a person who lies externally has no moral right to assume that they are not lying internally. To support this claim, Dubig provides the following passage from the Doctrine of Virtue. This is H on the handout. Man as a moral being cannot use himself as a natural being, as a mere means, a speaking machine, as if his natural being were not bound up to his inner end of communicating his thoughts, but is bound to the condition of using himself as a natural being in agreement with the declaration of his moral being and is under an obligation to himself to truthfulness. So, I find this portion of Dubig's paper peculiar. So again, Dubig asserts that Kant held that an external lie implies an internal lie, or more precisely, two, that a person who lies externally has no moral right to assume that they are not lying internally. So two strikes me as a rather different claim than one, not a more precise rendering of one. The relationship between one and two is unclear to me. Do we ever have a moral right to assume we are not lying internally? Doesn't seem to be the case. Moreover, the passage that Dubig cites from the Doctrine of Virtue does not appear to support either Claim 1 or Claim 2. So given that I'm primarily interested in what account of the wrongness of lying can be supported, rather than what view Kant actually held, I'll just raise the question. Does an external lie imply or entail an inner lie? When we lie to others, do we also lie to ourselves? I'm skeptical about whether there's such a strong connection between external and inner lies. In the case of inner lies, the liar and the recipient of the lie are the same person. Because of this, inner lies must take a rather different form than external lies. Inner lies do not require a speech act or declaration or even a statement. Given how we define a lie at the outset, it's at least somewhat problematic to call inner lies lies at all. To be guilty of an inner lie, one must persuade oneself to embrace a belief that one also believes is false or has good reason to believe is false. Dubig acknowledges this when he writes that in the case of an inner lie, the person makes themselves believe something untrue about themselves. So inner lies necessitate at least some degree of deception in a way that external lies do not. So inner lies lack a necessary condition for lying, being an assertion or an utterance, and they have a necessary condition, successful deception, that external lies do not. So inner lies function by concealing evidence, not paying attention to evidence, or exaggerating the importance of other evidence. What Kant calls inner lies seems to be more accurately described as self-deception. So the question is whether what we do externally, in terms of the representation of our thoughts, necessarily has consequences for what we do internally. I'm concerned that the psychological picture that Dubin has proposed has implications for other types of behavior, again, reticence and concealment. If we conceal our true thoughts from others, like Hill's deceptively ambiguous response, does it follow that we conceal our true thoughts from ourselves? Concealing one's true thoughts from ourselves is a kind of self-deception and an impediment to the cultivation of virtue. Notably, Kant is rather accepting of reticence and concealment. His attitudes towards these kinds of behaviors is quite different from the attitude he takes regarding lying. If there is a tight psychological connection between what we do externally and what we do internally with regard to the representation of our thoughts, Kant should have condemned these behaviors as well. However, if reticence and concealment vis-a-vis others do not make us more likely to engage in self-deception, then there's reason to think that external lies do not as well. And so I'm just sort of pushing it back against the broad generalization. So it might be that some kinds of external lies, like if I tell the same lie consistently for 20 years, there's probably a good chance there's some self-deception involved in there as well. But what I'm pushing it back against is this like necessary connection between every external lie and an internal lie. I think I can tell, like give a single instance lie without necessarily lying to myself or committing an inner lie. So it's plausible to think that complete transparency with oneself is necessary to guard against the ever-present threat of self-deception. And Kant and Dubin are correct in thinking that self-deception is an impediment to the cultivation of virtue. However, unless we can establish a fairly tight connection between external lies and inner lies, the justification for Kant's prohibition on inner lies does not easily transfer to external lies. So the fourth and final attempt to explain what makes lying wrong that I'll consider comes from Sienna Schifrin. In her 2014 book, Speech Matters, Schifrin presents an account of the wrong of lying that she claims is inspired by Kant's work and which she believes provides some plausible ground for a qualified form of Kant's absolutism about lying. In the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of give a brief sketch of Schifrin's argument. So she begins with this claim about epistemic dependence. So the first step in Schifrin's argument is the claim that we have a moral need to be able to access the contents of others' minds. According to Schifrin, we need to access the contents of others' minds insofar as we depend on one another's beliefs, knowledge, and reactions to our beliefs to construct a reliable picture of our world so that we can navigate through it and understand who we are and where we are situated. We need access to the contents of others' minds in order to fulfill moral duties that require responsiveness to others' thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and perceived needs. Schifrin does not specify which duties she has in mind, but beneficence seems pretty plausible. Third, we need access to the contents of others' minds in order to assess whether they have behaved well or badly. To know whether someone behaved well or badly, we need to know their reasons, motives, and beliefs. And fourth, we need to access others' minds for moral self-development. Relationships of recognition and close relationships, both necessary for full self-development and flourishing, depend on access to the contents of one another's minds. The second premise has to do with epistemic access. So the second premise in Schifrin's argument is the claim that testimony is the only authoritative mechanism we have for accessing the contents of others' minds, thoughts, beliefs, reasons, motives, etc. So if you want to know certain information about the world, like what time it is, or where the train station is located, you could ask someone for this information, but you could also consult a clock or a map. By contrast, if you need or want to accessing this information is my testimony. So according to Schifrin, the wrong of lying is that it operates on a maxim that, if it were universalized and constituted public rule, permissible action, would deprive us of reliable access to a crucial set of truths and a reliable way to sort the true from the false. So she sets up this argument, says, we need to have access to these certain kinds of mental content. The only way to get it is through testimony, and lying kind of corrupts this pathway. So I really like what Schifrin has done. However, I think that the conclusions that follow from her observation about epistemic dependence and access are more modest than some of the conclusions she draws in that chapter. So the kind of epistemic access to others' minds that we require for the moral purposes Schifrin describes seem to me to be very context or relationship dependent. We often need epistemic access to others' minds in order to execute role-based responsibilities, like those of a parent, or a physician, or a judge. In the context of a court of law, a judge or jury requires epistemic access to others' minds in order to assess guilt and culpability appropriately. In an intimate relationship, one needs to know these things in order to sustain the trust that enables the relationship. However, in many contexts, I don't think we need to access others' mental contents. For instance, in many contexts, I don't think we have any business trying to determine whether someone acted well or badly. Moreover, because human beings can and do lie for a variety of reasons, it doesn't seem to be the case that there's a single maxim of lying, but rather many different maxims of lying, some of which might be universalizable, like the maxim of lying to a stranger who asks for personal information they are not entitled to. I'm not sure that Schifrin would disagree with this. So she's got this idea of justified suspended context. So she writes, the truly interesting issues about lying, I submit, have to do with what contexts are justifiably suspended and why. A justified suspended context refers to context in which the speaker's potential insincerity is reasonable and justified. I think part of why Schifrin feels entitled to draw strong conclusions about lying is that she does not recognize certain classes of untruthful statements as lies. According to Schifrin, if I utter an untruth in a justified suspended context, I do not lie insofar as she believes that the third condition of lying is not met in such cases. I would argue that this holds only for some justified suspended contexts, like the utterance of an actor in a play. The utterance of an actor in a play, he does not intend for the audience to take what he says as an accurate representation of his thoughts. But there are other justified suspended contexts, etiquette being one of them, where I think the third condition isn't. Etiquette is a little different than speaking lies in a play. I think when we do tell etiquette lies, we want the other to take that untruthful statement as an accurate representation of our thoughts, even when it's not. At any rate, I think Schifrin has given us a lot to work with. Her observations about the moral value of having epistemic access to others' mental contexts lays a nice foundation, I think, for a cluster of moral prescriptions regarding communication in particular contexts or relationships, not just lying. And I think the idea of a justified suspended context is a promising avenue for thinking about when lying is not wrong. So to conclude, I'm skeptical that there is a universal wrong-making feature of lying.